It's 1943, and a group of T-34s move out from the tree line to begin their attack. As they trundle forward through the morning fog, the crews are on edge, knowing the German forces are ahead. Both tankers and infantry hope that the fog will remain to help conceal them, but as it begins to lift, their fears are soon realized. Gunfire erupts, forcing them back as a single shell whistles through the air, finding its mark on one of the retreating T-34s with a loud bang. Unbeknownst to the Soviet troops, they had just witnessed one of Nazi Germany's newest war machines, the Nashorn. While that intro is about as much action as I can afford to put into these videos with my small budget, thanks to today's sponsor, World of Tanks, you can get your fill of tank action completely free. World of Tanks is a free-to-play online vehicle combat game that features over 800 armored vehicles, including the Nashorn. If sniping as a lightly armored tank destroyer isn't quite your style, don't worry because you can choose between light tanks, medium tanks, heavy tanks, artillery, and more to find whatever suits your playstyle. Once you pick your vehicle, drop into battle across over 40 maps and support your team as you fight for victory. Start playing today using my link and the code COMBAT to get a bonus pack to kickstart your progress, including the Tier 6 Premium Cromwell B, 250,000 credits, 7 days of premium account time, and 3 rental tanks for you to try out for 10 battles each. If you're an existing player who hasn't played in a while, you can also get some free goodies, including a tank rental, free camouflage, and 3 days of premium time. Huge thanks to them for continuing to support my content. Now let's turn back the pages of history as we learn about our main topic. Despite the belief by many that German tanks were far superior to those of the Allied nations, we have a variety of examples proving this was not always the case in every aspect. In fact, during the early stages of World War II, the armor fielded by the Wehrmacht was in many ways inferior to those of their enemies. Tanks such as the Char B1, Matildas, KVs, and many others proved difficult for the weak armaments of the early panzers and often could do little against such vehicles without the support of weapons like the 88 flak gun. This would lead not just to the development of heavier tanks with larger guns, such as the Ferdinand and Jagdtiger, but also to less ridiculous designs. Among these would be a variety of open-top tank destroyers ranging from one based on the Panzer I all the way to the 12.8 cm armed Sturr Emil. Today, though, we will be focusing on one which is often overlooked compared to its more eye-catching cousins. The Nashorn would be conceived as part of an effort started by Hitler in 1942 to create an 8.8 cm anti-tank gun matching the performance of the 8.8 cm Flak 41, which would become known as the Pak 43. While smaller anti-tank guns could be moved with relative ease, the larger guns such as the 8.8 cm were impossible to move without heavy equipment. For this reason, it was decided that creating a vehicle which could carry this gun would be quite useful. While originally this was to be mounted on an entirely new chassis, it was soon realized that this would not be ready for production by early 1943, and the decision was made to instead create a more expedient version which would use parts from the Panzer III and IV. The contract for this design would be given to Alket, who would return with a completed design by the beginning of October 1942. Just at a glance, it was already clear that the vehicle was built using existing parts, with the chassis being very similar to the Panzer IV it was based on. These were not interchangeable though, with the hull of the Hornisse, as it was then known, being wider than the Panzer IV at the same width as the Panzer III. This led to the drivetrain being made up of a mixture of components from both vehicles. As for the suspension, this matched the hull, with it also from the Panzer IV. However, despite the similarities on its lower half, the Hornisse was completely different above that. The front of the vehicle featured a sloped plate replacing the more stepped design of the original, only being broken up by a protruding position for the driver. Behind that sat a large, thinly armored fighting compartment to house the rest of the crew as well as the main gun and its ammunition. As the eagle-eyed among you may have guessed, the engine was moved from the rear towards the middle of the vehicle, which was fed air through openings on the sides of the hull. This helped to better balance the vehicle as well as create a clearer fighting compartment for the crew. Speaking of the crew, this would consist of 5 men with a commander, gunner, and loader in the rear, as well as a driver and radio operator in the hull. In order to feed the massive 8.8cm Pak 43/1 L71, it would carry 40 rounds of various types, as well as around 1,000 rounds of smaller caliber ammunition for the crew's different small arms. As for the main gun, it was able to traverse 15 degrees to either side with a maximum elevation of 20 degrees and 5 degrees of depression. While the firepower was certainly impressive, the armor was a bit less so, being only 30mm at its thickest on the hull front, with the majority of the vehicle protected only by a thin 10mm superstructure. The benefit of this thin armor was far less weight than more heavily armored tank destroyers, but it still ended up being significantly heavier than the original Panzer IV, only being surpassed by later up-armored models. With the same HL-120 Maybach engine of the Panzer IV providing it with 265 horsepower, it was capable of an average road speed of around 25 km per hour and a maximum speed of 40 km per hour. Before we go further, I should mention that this was not the only vehicle to be built using this new chassis, with another, known as the Hummel, meaning Bumblebee, also being built. That vehicle, rather than being a tank destroyer, was created as a self-propelled artillery and armed with a 15cm howitzer. A total of 705 of them were built by the end of the war, with the later production vehicles featuring a redesigned frontal hull to give the driver and radio operator more space. Additionally, 157 ammunition carrier variants were built with a modified version of the same chassis to supply units fielding Hummels with a steady supply of ammo. One additional change to the Hummel was the inclusion of an additional crew member, bringing the count up to 6, with 4 of those manning the gun. Units controlling these SPGs would see combat on all fronts, with even a few examples of captured Hummels being pressed back into service on the Eastern Front. An additional odd variant of the Hummel appeared late in the war, consisting of a Hummel chassis fitted with the 10.5cm gun from the Vesp, another type of SPG. Reports indicate 10 of these were accepted in 44-45, with a single photo remaining of one. Presumably, these SPGs being used for more indirect fire roles meant they suffered less from the problems caused by the thin armor compared to their tank destroyer relatives. Back to the Hornisse, production would kick off in early 1943, with a total of 494 being built, with the last being completed in March of 1945. By now you may be wondering why I have thus far been referring to this vehicle as Hornisse, which translates to Hornet. The reason for this is the same as we discussed in the previous episode on the Ferdinand. Despite the fact that having 2 similar vehicles being named Hornet and Bumblebee is a pretty solid naming scheme if you ask me, a certain man by the name of Hitler seemingly did not agree, and in November of 1943, the name was officially changed to Nashorn, meaning rhino. This was the same time when the Ferdinand, named after Ferdinand Porsche, had its name changed to the Elephant. So don't be confused if you see the Nashorn referred to by its former name, they are the same vehicle. Despite being essentially the opposite end of the tank destroyer spectrum compared to the heavily armored Ferdinand, the Nashorn would see a similarly mixed performance in combat. Strangely, even though it weighed less than half what the Ferdinand did, both vehicles suffered similar problems, with a major one being overheating. This is not too surprising for the Nashorn, given the mounting of the engine placed it in a mostly enclosed area, and if you know anything about engines, you know they don't tend to like that. The weight of the vehicle also played a part in this. Another problem was found with the sighting system, which during travel would move, causing a significant shift in the accuracy due to the gun and sight no longer being aligned. That issue was later remedied, however, as with any tank, small problems always occur, which often kept these rhinos out of combat. Above all other things though, the thin armor of the Nashorn can be seen as its biggest flaw. This armor was hardly even strong enough to stop small arms fire, let alone dedicated anti-tank guns, and combined with the lack of a roof, made them easy prey for aircraft. This was compounded by units in the field repeatedly misusing their Nashorns, which led to losses which otherwise could have been avoided. We know this must have been significant as it led to the creation of what is essentially a how to not get yourself killed guide for the crews. This instructed them to use the Nashorn in the role which suited it best, knocking out targets from a distance. These instructions can be found in Panzertrack 7.3 and read as follows. The Schwere Panzerjäger Abteilung Hornisse is the mobile defense for the command to concentrate against strong enemy tank attacks. Employ as an Abteilung or company, distributing under company strength reduces operational readiness because then controlled by radio, resupplying ammunition and maintenance are not possible. 2. The Hornisse is an 8.8 cm Pack-auf-Selbstfahrwaffe. Its strengths are long-range rapid fire with accurate sights that can engage all types of tanks at range up to 4 kilometers and mobility as a self-propelled gun. Its weakness are the high superstructure and light armor. 3. The Hornissen await the enemy tank attack in ambush and firing positions. Thorough scouting is needed. 4. Schwere Panzerjäger Hornissen are not Sturmgeschütz or Panzer and are not to be employed like them. 5. Listen to the commander of the Hornissen before giving orders. The value of these vehicles lie in the range of the gun. Their effective range is from 1,000 to 3,000 meters. While the lack of armor did hold them back, similarly to how too much armor held the Ferdinands back, when used correctly using concealment and range, the Nashorn was incredibly lethal. One example showed 12 KVs and 4 T-34s taken out of action at the cost of just a single Nashorn. Another tells of a single Nashorn commanded by Lieutenant Albert Ernst destroying 8 T-34s in a single day and another 14 with only 21 rounds of ammunition just a few weeks later. Out of all these examples though, the funniest is probably the IS-2 knocked out by a Nashorn from the Panzerjäger Abteilung 88, who quickly knocked out the tank after spotting it on the move. Unfortunately for them, this particular IS-2 had already been captured and it was being towed back behind friendly lines. I guess you could call that a real-world case of kill stealing. As for non-Soviet armor, a Nashorn was credited with the destruction of one of the few Pershings to be knocked out during World War II and the only one to be written off. Remarkably, the shell penetrated the Pershing, passing between the driver's legs, setting the tank on fire, but the crew were able to escape and survive even if the tank was lost to the flames. Reportedly, the Pershing was still repairable. Those repairs would have required several months of work though, leading to it being used instead for parts. These tank destroyers would see use across the different fronts against all manner of Allied armor, none of which were capable of withstanding its firepower, but similarly, the Nashorn could not withstand their return fire, being a true glass cannon. Following the end of the war, the story gets a little fuzzy, with some sources claiming 12 Nashorn ended up in the hands of the Czechoslovakian army. However, other sources indicate they received the same number of Hummels, leading me to believe this may be a case of mistaken identity given how similar the two look. If you happen to have any additional information on this, please feel free to share it with me, as I have been unable to completely verify that theory. As for the Hummel, several ended up in Syria thanks to France, and one briefly saw use by Romania in a parade, which we can see faintly in the background of this photo. When I was first starting this script, I was honestly unsure of which series the Nashorn would fit best into, initially thinking it might be a Forged for Battle candidate, but I think we can all see it is truly deserving of the Cursed by Design label. Between the Nashorn and the Ferdinand, we are provided with real-world examples of the problems of both too little armor as well as too much armor. While this is far from a set-in-stone rule, given the performance of vehicles such as the thin-skinned M18 Hellcat, we certainly see why vehicles with both reasonable firepower as well as decent protection are often preferred. Today, only 3 examples of the Nashorn remain, with one in Kubinka in Russia, one in the US as part of the US Army Armor and Cavalry Collection, and a final example owned privately in the Netherlands. Unfortunately, it was the victim of a garage fire which caused some damage, but that has since been repaired and it is currently the only operation example in the world. As for the Hummel, there are 6 surviving examples in various museums, with an extraordinary example at the Australian Armour and Artillery Museum, which was basically pieced back together like a jigsaw puzzle. So what do you think of this thin-skinned rhino and its stinging stepbrother? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below, and while you're down there, be sure to try out World of Tanks using that link and the code COMBAT to get that starter bonus if you are a new player. Thank you all so much for watching, and just a quick reminder that the Cone Fumo will still be available for a few days after this video's release, so make sure to grab one if you haven't already. Thanks as always to my channel members for their support of this content, and if you enjoyed, be sure to leave a like, subscribe for more, and check out my video on the Ferdinand if you haven't done so already. Hope to see you there.